Hey, this is David Rovix, and I'm here with Paula DeAngelis and Vincent Cross with another episode of our sort of more or less monthly series of Song News Network Presents, where me and Paula discuss things related to music and history, and often so far once and now twice with another actual person who's doing work with both music and history. And Vincent is from New York City by way of Ireland and Australia, and his latest album is The Life and Times of James the Rooster Corcoran, and it's absolutely fantastic album that I've just been listening to very recently, like in the past hour, and and it's all about your own actual family history. I mean, it's first of all, it's something I've always thought about doing and never did, like a themed album. But it's and it's all about your actual ancestor, who was a notorious Irish American gangster in New York City. And it's but the album doesn't feel like gangster music to me. It's very concertinas, I guess. It's I love the use that concertinas all over the place, and those harmonies, and it's just a wonderful album. But I wonder, can we just start with talking about how you came up with this themed album idea in the first place, and then it got around to actually executing the themed album idea?
But okay, it's great to be here, by the way, and it's good to be talking with you two. It's been a while.
Ages.
Yeah, years even.
Yeah,
many years.
Yeah.
Have you guys actually met, the two of you? Have you guys met in physical form?
Yeah,
Oh, that's right. In Australia, right?
Right.
Yes, that's right. Vincent did a tour here several years ago. Yeah.
And the last time I saw you was like 10 years ago, I think, at the PMN gathering in New York, right?
That's right.
Long time ago. Very long time.
God, time.
You look. I must say, you look just as good as you did then, but your hair has completely changed color.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a fairly dramatic.
It's pretty
process.
intense. Yeah. For years, to be honest, it went gray at the front, and so I was able to kind of just pat it all forward.
Right.
And then it just looked a little less. And then I said, fuck it. No.
Yeah. Gray hair is great.
Definitely.
Look.
Give it the full whack. If you're going to do something, go all out,
That's right.
So
I changed the part in my hair so that it would.
Oh,
we're having that. Well, that's good that there's three of us, because if one of our screens, you froze up for a minute there, Paula. But
yeah, so did you guys.
Yeah, that's how it goes, huh?
So I'll get back to your question.
Yeah, talk about the album. And when I'm muting myself, it's just because there's a dishwasher here, so I'm just like going for sound quality.
So the question I think you asked was, how did I just refresh me? I think how did I get the idea to do this particular album about the ancestor? Was that?
Yeah, give us a research journey, Vincent.
The research journey, the history, the interest in genealogy. And then also having the interest enough to actually go to the point of writing a whole bunch of songs and making a themed album. I mean, learning to play the concertina. I mean, I could subdivide this question into a whole lot of other questions, and I will. But just like overview, can you give us an overview how you got around to this? And then I'll start. We can ask a lot more nitty gritty questions. But just I guess I'm looking for an overview of what got you to do this album.
Okay, I'll try. I think this is a process that has been happening for 10 years. I had an album called Home Away from Home, and it was bluegrass. And the moniker for it was, new songs in the high lonesome tradition. So I spent years playing bluegrass and studying the form, and then writing in that form. And so I was always interested in that, because prior to that, I was a songwriter at the slave of my emotional muse. And you write on your acoustic guitar, and it came from within first. And then I started to become very interested in traditional styles and genres. So it started, I think, with bluegrass. And then I moved on then to old songs from modern folk. And that came out in 2016. And that was like, I imagine myself being in the Greenwich Village in the 1960s. And I'm a songwriter. And I'm surrounded by Mississippi John Hurt, Doc Boggs, Alan Lomax, and political of issues of the time. And I just took that in a nugget and dropped myself into 2016. And that was Michael Brown, and that was the sort of the political slant. In each project, I generally learn instruments and I study the singing form. For the bluegrass, it was mandolin strictly, and guitar, but a lot of mandolin leads. For the old songs from modern folk, it was Piedmont guitar styling for the solo songs, and clawhammer banjo, because those two styles are very full in a solo capacity. Like bluegrass banjo doesn't really work when you play it on its own in the same way. It's very, very difficult to get that kind of coordination going. So those projects were all based around concepts, unbeknownst to myself, and I think the idea could come from people like, here's a quote by Pete Seeger. Pete Seeger, in his book, The Incomplete Folk Singer, he says, what Woody did was he tied together the old and the new in an almost unbroken seam. And I kind of thought that way, that if I could add lyrics and songs and ideas from now to the old songs to create this seamlessness, still aware of the time that I'm in. And this leads me to Corcoran, because Corcoran I keep going further back. I'm wondering how much further I'm going back, because now I'm going back to the 1800s and I'm going pre-recordings here. What are the instruments? What is the musical context of the time? And the context is the Broadside Ballad and the Child Ballad and the traditional songs. And so I just spent years kind of learning songs from those traditions, and the language of those songs. And then imagining I'm a songwriter again. I'm a time-traveling songwriter, and I'm in. It's 1850, and I hear of this man called Corcoran, and I read about him in the paper, because that's where most people of the working class are usually. They're usually in the paper for doing something wrong, and he was constantly in the paper because he was constantly causing a ruckus during the time. And I just imagine I was a Broadside Ballad writer. And here this character is, and I would write songs based on how the journalists represented him through these articles, because I had the language, I had the perspective, and I had the interest in what it might be to be an Irish American in the 1800s, being sort of an Irish American in 2017, 18, 19. So I was curious to see if I could connect with the immigrant experience by writing about it through him and that time. Whew. That's Did that help?
That's a wonderful introduction to the whole concept of what you're doing with this album. Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. And you answered my one of my questions was going to be, what exactly is a broadside ballad? So,
Oh, great.
You answered that too.
They're wonderful.
Well, how would you answer that question? I mean,
I'm the broadside ballad was the early journalism of its time. That's how it's often seen, you'd have an event going on and somebody would write it down and it'd be a ballad, and it would usually be to the air of something everybody knew, because most people couldn't read music, but somebody would know an air to a song, and often the airs wouldn't change that much. And there is actually one song on the album about Alfred W. Hicks. He was a serial killer in the time, and I had read about him in Gangs of New York, because that's where Corcoran gets a mention.
Are you related to Hicks, or he was just sort of somehow in the scene at the time?
He was a contemporary. And like you said, how do you go about writing a whole album about a family of people that you've never met, that you've got really nothing on except the fact that you've discovered that you're related to them, which was a very long-winded process.
But did you manage to find out much about them? And what was it like researching the Corcoran family? I mean, like, were they people that actually were there people involved who kept extensive notes or memoirs, or did any of that kind of thing, or were you mainly relying on arrest records and marriage certificates? Or I mean, it's like there's such wildly varied levels of information available about different people once you go that far back, from nothing to a whole lot, right?
Yeah, and you said all the sources you found were primary sources, didn't you, at one stage?
Yeah, I'm an amateur in the world of. I wish somebody wrote a book about him and what he did and his family, but there was no book. There was just these stories and from the newspaper articles, and so most of it was I found somebody on Ancestry.com who had snipped all the articles about him, and that person, I figured they were Corcoran, and they were a direct descendant of him, and they weren't. And so I looked at all these articles, and I had been told by a cousin in England that we were related to him. In fact, the bottom line was I was told by my father to go down and take a picture of myself in front of an inscription in Tudor City in Manhattan, which read, "Here was Corcoran's roost in 1877." It's in a Gothic inscription. And this was like a physical, a real physical, tangible piece of family history that I'd just been told about. And because I was the only one in New York, they said, go down, take a picture of yourself beside it. You're related to that guy. And I promptly took the picture and put the idea to the side, because I said, I read he actually had a New York Times obituary from 1901. And I read it and I went, this guy is very interesting, but what the hell has it got to do with me? And I said, and gradually when I wrapped up Old Songs from Modern Folk, I said, Vincent, you're writing about real people. Why not take this? Why not write about this person that's related to you, and try and cover a little bit of your own family history? And the great thing about Corcoran is he was the one that came to America, but some of them stayed in Ireland and were part of the Irish Revolution in the War for Independence. One of the Corcorans who stayed behind was actually sent to assassinate Lloyd George, the Prime Minister, as an Irish volunteer. He had a pistol inside his pocket, and this is in the IRA Bureau military files. His name was Willie Corcoran, not James Corcoran, but Willie Corcoran, in 1920. And there he is with a pistol in his pocket, waiting for Lloyd George to conscript the Irish. And he was supposed to shoot him, and that would be the end of that story. But so you have these. I didn't know the my grandmother is the Corcoran. I never met her, and so I'm going, these Corcorans are quite interesting.
Did you find any similarities between the two lines? I mean, it's such a fascinating way that thought that people can go in such different directions. I mean, you think of, like, at least for a lot of people, I would say that you think of the sort of self-sacrifice involved with a struggle for independence of a sort like the IRA, and then you think of the sort of the opposite when it comes to gangsters, and at least the idea in the popular imagination, however realistic it is that they're out for themselves, and they're just looking out for their own families, perhaps, but not for the wider community, and they're more like parasites on the wider community. I mean, I don't know. It's just like it's just taken to the extreme sort of viewpoint. So it seems very interesting to have those different lines there.
Well, they're revolutionaries. The point that I think there's a connection is that I was trying to understand these are rebels, and rebels can come in all sizes and shapes. And if you're rebelling against an empire like the British Empire, like Willie was as an assassin going to kill but you're also a rebel if you land in another country as an immigrant, because nobody's sort of seeing you as a legitimate individual, and you have to find a way to fight for your independence. And in a sense, it's a sort of rebellion against that society. And he was, in his way here, a rebel right till he died. He was 82, and he defended a piece of land. He just took it in Manhattan. It was the Corcoran's roost. He just said, this is ours. And all the Irish people came and lived there, and no police would go in there. And it was lawless, except for him. He was the law, Corcoran, in Corcoran's Roost. which to me is
Where was
phenomenal.
that?
It's where the United Nations is today, which blows my mind. A place of international migrant discussions and immigrant and world. And here we have all the immigrants just creating this, or the Irish immigrants turning this place into Ireland. It was Tara Hill. They defended it as if it was the nation of Ireland. You know, in the same sense.
It happened all the time.
Pardon?
It happened all the time.
It did in Australia. It was the same thing with Ned Kelly. Ned Kelly goes.
Did you find Australian Corcorans?
I haven't, but you have Ned Kelly, you know, because he went down there and they got the bad land and they made their stab, and they said they weren't going to have the system have their foot on their neck and crush them. And when they fought again, and there's so many things. Ned Kelly is a very interesting story because it was many Irish people that were in the police who had been immigrants over there, who were the ones that, and he was a native. He had been born there, and that's an incredible story, Ned Kelly's story.
There's some great intersectings. I mean, if you're studying Irish history, this is what you get. They're like a textbook for transnational labor history in this era, because they were everywhere and they all kept in touch, you know, and you got into, and it's still there to this day. No one's the Irish have worked out how to be simultaneously nationalist and internationalist. Right? Yeah. So it's reflected in the history all the time. And that story is similar to so many Irish stories, you know. And so James Larkin, for example, who's one of my favorite Irish revolutionaries, who was mostly influential in London, in England. His brother was here in Australia, and he was one of the Wobblies who got put in jail, right? So Jim Larkin defended him from over there in Ireland, and Jim spent some time with the Wobblies in the United States, and so you've got this whole sort of interconnection. And, you know, that's another very small reflection of a very similar story.
Yeah.
So the connections are always interesting, I think, and you've found this great story, and it shows you what this kind of international working class from this era. Yeah.
It does, and the word is funny because we could say rebel, we could say outlaw, we could say revolutionary, we could say hero. I mean, these were.
That's Ned Kelly. What, you know, it depends who you ask.
Exactly. Yeah, you've heard. I was reading about that too. What was it to the families of the police officers that were shot? He was a murderer. You know.
Yeah.
And to the people that he was standing up for, he was a hero. And Corcoran operates under the same thing. When he died, he had a huge funeral apparently. And he was considered a champion of the Irish. And there's many who believe he was what's the phrase I read somewhere about mayhem? He was the master of mayhem. Because during the riots in the 60s, the draft riots, I mean, he's only down he robbed the houses left, right, and center along there, the rich houses, you know. And
what did he do?
Well, during that period, you know, he robbed all the rich houses. When the city was in turmoil during the draft riots, and New York City, that was New York City's highest or largest civil insurrection, bar none. You know, you had a population of 800,000 people, and 400,000 were immigrants, and 200,000 were Irish. So they were the ones being drafted into the Civil War, and they weren't going to have it. And so the city was in eruptions, and Corcoran is there. He's just a hop, skip, and a jump down the road. I need to do a lot more research. I wish, because there's just I have to go back in. I have to figure out. There's no mention of.
There's always more research.
Yeah. What did you find about that? I mean, because I think that's a especially interesting period to talk about, and especially that whole contrast of the Irish immigrant experience in the United States as opposed to the Irish experience in Ireland. Because, like, I mean, having spent a lot of time in both, you know, among Irish the Irish American community, I guess you could say, and Irish people in Ireland. I mean, I know there's a lot of tension there in that a lot of people in Ireland are very uncomfortable with what they see as the racist white orientation that some of their American relatives have adopted over the generations when they come visit their relatives in America, and they're like, "Oh wow, we don't talk about people like this back at home. This is really unattractive. And how did you get this way? And why did you become this way?" But then and then the draft riots in the 1860s in New York. If anybody has ever heard of them, which of course most people haven't, but if they've heard anything about them, then they have heard them depicted as a purely racist thing. But really, it's a much more complex reality.
Yes.
Can you what do you find out about that period? Talk about it.
Well, it's interesting because you did pick the word. There are two ways you'll find books, and most of the books that I've read on it don't call it the race riots; they call it the draft riots. And in that choice of wording, it's that's significant in and of itself. There is, I was looking for songs, asking around historians. I says, are there any songs in the Irish immigrant tradition that discuss the race riots, the draft riots, and what actually happened, and the Irish? And I didn't get a lot back in terms of songs, but there is a book called "How the Irish Became White." And it's an interesting book. It has its flaws on some levels, and there are some positives behind how why the animosity built in terms of it was an economic issue apparently, and there was this kind of fear as the Irish were emerging as how would you say, they were rising up to become a part of the American society, they followed the rules of the WASP establishment, and so they to do that they had to follow what the rules were set down upon them to rise into that position. Don't know how. See, you're getting all this, but I was trying to find something more directly connected to some individual. I mean, I'd love to know exactly what Corcoran did. I found something that said that he robbed the houses during the draft riots. And I'm going, well, where did that come from? This is just a blog entry called Tudor City. And the guy that runs it got it from some historian, but it's hard to find any conclusive evidence that he did such a thing. Until I find it, I don't really know what he did. And then so I wanted to actually have a song about the draft riots on the album. I thought, how can I do that even, Mm-hmm. But there is never a song on the draft riots or the race riots.
Did you find anything else that that other people wrote?
Nothing. I found absolutely no songs. And then I'm thinking, wow, Vincent, write one. And I thought, well, hold on. How do I do that?
That's so hard because if there was anything to go on where you could tell what was the perspective of anybody involved on any of the different sides of the equation.
Right. And I couldn't. I mean, I could get with the other songs like King Corcoran, that was easy. I just read all the obituaries, and there were hundreds of them really during that time, because there were, as you know, there were hundreds of newspapers in New York City. I think there were about 250 tabloids. It was print city.
Many different languages. Yeah.
And so I was able to just take bits from here and bits from there and bits from there and kind of stitch together this song, King Corcoran, and relay that story easily. And even with the women in his life, Catherine and Mary. Catherine is I'm really happy with that song because that was an article, and I just took I used the Kamalia style of writing ballads. Come you ladies and you gentlemen, listen to my tale. I was standing over here. And so I just followed that. And what I loved about that was those were her words, as she said them, the wife of James Corcoran, to the policeman, and I thought, this is great. I get the language and I get the story, and all I have to do is find the melody and the instrumentation.
And the instrumentation with the I mean, going with the sort of period instruments. I mean, it just feels you just feel transported to the 19th century, and those long dwelling introductions. Like I just feel like I'm out on the prairie somewhere, and it's wonderful stuff. It's amazing. It's like such simple lines can be so can just suck you right in, right? Just a few notes in that thing.
It was an interesting concept because one of the things I made sure was there were no guitars on the album.
There are no guitars on the album?
Not a guitar on it. And it was funny because, the guitar it's become such a solid sound in most of our constructs of music. I played the guitar my entire career until I switched over to mandolins, back in 2004. But the guitar was still the instrument I wrote on, and historically speaking, the guitar isn't a dominant instrument in the early 1800s. It really doesn't come into strength until the early 1920s.
It's a very quiet instrument, at least before the steel string, right? It wasn't really practical.
Yeah, and so I figured I had the license here to remove it, and if I remove it, then I can't go back to things I'd normally play. And that left it. And then the big jump for me, once I had the mandolin and the bouzouki instruments going and the strings, was the concertina, because I'm a string person. And here is this box, this big, and you play it. There's just no way to communicate. I can communicate mandolin to bouzouki. I can communicate guitar to banjo. There are these things. But where does this thing come into it? But it was a magical. It's the only instrument I'm playing right now because it's a magically transformative instrument. It was invented in the early 1800s, but it created the possibility of drones and layers. And I could have gone with the Anglo concertina, but I wasn't good enough because that's the one where you push and pull, and you've got to be able to. It's a real animal, and it sounds great. And I went with the English because it's same note as you push and you pull, and you get to do a lot of chordal things when you're singing.
Is it air? What keeps the sound going? Is it air?
Let me show you.
Oh, yeah.
That's right. Give us a demo, Vincent.
That's one of the many handy things of being at home when you do these interviews, right? You got everything right there.
I'm like, this is a relevant book, Vincent.
What's your book here? What's the book, Paula?
So this book is, because as David knows, one of my other obsessions is marine transport workers and the early 20th century history.
Waterfront. What is it? Read the title. I can't see it.
It's called Waterfront Revolt, New York and London dock workers, and it's a comparison about it looks basically it's looking at the different ways that the Irish influenced London dock worker politics compared to New York politics. So it's like a comparative case study, right? Wonderful. But it's really interesting because he at one point this was an insight for me, and this is an insight into what you're dealing with, is what he shows you is that in London, the Irish identity kind of melded into the working class identity. There was less issue made of being Irish, and more that they were part of the working class. Whereas in New York, you had a different trajectory. And by the 1950s, when this book is set, you've got that institutionalization.
I can't speak for her
identity
now,
rather than a class identity, right?
Wait, StreamYard was punishing you for saying too long a word there. Institutionalization, was it? That's when they say, okay, we're freezing up now.
Well, that's, this is the point where all those kind of New York groups joined the system. That's what you're talking about? You've got a different trajectory. Everybody got your ancestor set up a situation where he was protecting his fellow Irishmen. And I think in New York, you've got this trajectory where the Irish kind of banded together as an ethnic group and then they started to gain political clout as that kind of, with that kind of Irish national identity. So you end up with a different interpretation of Irishness and how that works in with the rest of the community. Yeah.
Right. And so in the waterfront thing, they say in London it was different. They didn't do that. Is that what you said?
Yeah, that's right. So what you had as a result, what you had in London was a maritime union that was much more syndicalist in approach than the unions in New York, which had set up by that stage, had set up in that kind of conventional, the classic New York union. That's what we think of. It's Italians these days, but that was the structure there. It was hierarchical and sort of top down.
Right.
Yeah. And very much based on being Irish and being white. And there's a whole other interesting history there about, as you were saying with the book, how the Irish became white. Yeah, because back in that era, they weren't considered. There was a the idea that white applies to everybody who's not black. That's actually a quite modern idea, and it was in the 19th century. You can look at newspapers from that era. They refer to Irish people as black. They refer to Europeans as black. My great grandfather's Italian, and he wasn't considered white when he first came out here. In Australia, Italians weren't white. It took a couple of generations for people to think that the white Australia policy excluded Southern Europeans. So it's subject to change.
I have a book on that
characterization, and that's what happened to the Irish in the United States. Yeah.
Any idea how many people showed up for your for the funeral there that you mentioned?
You're a little echoing there, David.
Yeah, there's echo going on all over the place. I don't know where that's coming from, but
it's every now and then. I'd love to read more about that funeral. It was supposed to be one of the largest funerals on the Lower East Side, but history is a strange thing. It can be buried very easily, and you have to do it almost like a memorist's job. You have to be an archaeologist. You sort of have to dig around, and I tried to figure out who paid for the inscription. It's a good place to start. I mean, if that's the last physical thing that's left to show that he existed. I did find where he was buried, which is just actually 3 stops down the road from where I live now. He's on Calvary Cemetery on the 7 train. And that was kind of, I knew I was in the right place to do the album, because I knew I could go down to the 5 points and I could go up to the places that he was in, and also channel what it means for me to be an immigrant. And there was all that lurking there. This is the concertina, by the way.
Wonderful.
And you get a
That's an English concertina, yeah?
Yeah. You can play tunes. So you have these. Those kind of. So I had a lot of fun with that. It was like, okay, let's just play these chords. I think there's an Aaron.
But that what you're just doing right there, that's actually like more busy than most of what you're doing on the album, right? I mean, what you're doing on the album is such like meditative, droning, gorgeous. I mean, and it made me think of like a little bit. I wonder if whoever came up with the concertina had traveled around India, because I guess there would have been a lot of contact between England and India around that time. Because it's such a droning instrument, really. At least, certainly, the way you're approaching it on the album.
That droning thing is. I was listening to a particular band from the 70s. I must also confess that there I was delving into sort of sounds of the 1800s, but I also focused on a small window of artists from Ireland in the 1970s. And Nafili was a band of 3 people with pipes, whistle, and fiddle, whistle, and uilleann pipes. And there were just 3 people, but they would layer things in a way that I was going, wow, you get this melody on the whistle, and then suddenly a low note would go, wham, and then the fiddle would come in, and then they would all shift. And it wasn't chordal in the conventional sense. It was like together they created these tonal shifts. And I was enamored with that kind of movement. And if I was playing a guitar, I felt like the guitar would box in the harmony. Whereas this made me think outside of that box of harmony, and they were inspirational. I put them on constantly as I would listen to them, and some of the ideas I got from them, because I think drones are really, I never used them before. The idea of a drone, this low note, and then stack another note on it, and then shift it, and it's just like it's hypnotic. It is hypnotic, and you've got that note. If you whether you're just you've got this sort of. As soon as you sing one note, you're creating a harmony.
Because the concertina sounds so much like a voice, and then it's so easy. And then if you have another voice, as you do on many of the tracks, then you've got 3-part or 4-part. Yeah, wonderful harmony.
I actually took all my singing down on that. I usually sing quite high. In this album, I sang very low. And I was going, what am I going to do? I've seen all these in the lower register, and it works because I was used to bluegrass. So I had this voice, and then I said, okay, I'll stick a harmony on top. I had no idea how it would sound, because in traditional songs, harmonies don't exist. The idea of harmony comes much later. A lot of traditional singers, it's just, and when they do sing, it's not a harmony, it's unison singing.
So really, that's interesting. I mean, so bluegrass, which is so there's so much harmony in bluegrass, and it's so popular, and it's so related to Irish music, and at least in the 90s, certainly was very, very popular in Ireland itself too. Although I don't know if it still is, but so that harmony is not traditional Irish. Like, is that African then? I mean, along with the 7th, because I mean, African, because harmony is so common in African music traditionally. I mean, vocal harmony, as well as the use of the 7th. Alistair Hewlett used to talk about how the so much Irish and Scottish music got sort of turned into a sort of, it still maintained its form, but became much bluesier with a lot of 7ths and different kind of elements like that in Appalachian tradition. But maybe that was also with where the harmonies were coming in too. I don't know. Is that it? Yeah. Anyway, I
think it's interesting, because if you've ever sung along to the vacuum cleaner and you hit the pentatonics, and you've got the vacuum, and I used to love that, vacuuming and just harmonizing with the vacuum cleaner. And that's all you're doing. You're hearing that note, and then you're hearing these particular harmonic steps that, and then you just sing from that point to that point below it, and that would be your harmony. I didn't do a lot of really high work, except occasionally. So the harmonies are very tight harmonies.
Yeah.
And the bluegrass harmonies can tend to be quite, here's one baritone, and here's one that's really high up in the tenor. And that seems to be the magic Ralph Stanley kind of Stanley Brothers harmony thing. Whereas the harmonies seemed, because I was lower down, I was able to sing another note between the high and the other one. And that to me was like a different way of approaching the singing on this.
There were a lot of what I would identify as, I think, minor thirds, but there was also closer stuff that gave a real Balkan kind of feel. Although the sort of the concertina, I think, gives it that sort of airy kind of countryside in Scotland kind of feel to me, and then the Balkan harmony. But altogether, very traditional 18th and 19th century sound. I thought you just pulled off that so well.
I got lucky with the banjo. I mean, I actually did an odd thing with the banjo because it's not clawhammer, but it's sort of like two-finger style, which was a common style before clawhammer and bluegrass took over. And I put nylon strings on the banjo to give it that warm, funky sound. So
cool.
You get this and I went, oh, it sounds beautiful when you play it on a piezo pickup. It's just got this warmth and sound, but it doesn't sound great when you clawhammer on it.
With the nylon?
No.
Uh-huh.
And that was fun. And I went down, and the weird thing is I went down to Augusta for a banjo workshop back about 2017. I wasn't touring.
Augusta, Georgia?
No, it's not Augusta. Is it? Yeah, it's Augusta. It's not in Georgia. It's the Augusta Heritage Center. I think it's in the West Virginia or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I followed a few people around who could play stuff by Doc Boggs and Lee Sexton. I wanted the style of the solo singer balladeer types from the 20s, because I couldn't work it out from the recordings, and I didn't want the clawhammer and the banjo, but I wanted those guys' songs because they were able to create a droney sound on the banjo. So I knew there was a connection. You would have that modal sounding banjo across a modal sounding drone, and then you'd have the harmonies close together. And I had no idea when you put all that together, because I played all the instruments except for the whistle and the bower, and I didn't know what it was going to sound like when they all were together. I had an idea, but I didn't have any. I didn't really. It was like, it's like, how would you put it? Some people, they have a great idea of what things might be when they're finished. I don't think I work like that. So I just keep thinking, I think this might need this, and trying to stay true to the sounds, keep the guitars out. And it was a complete experiment. And it doesn't fit anywhere, because traditional musicians think the songs are traditional. And when I tell them they're not, they walk away in disgust.
He likes to be caught like wrong like that. If they know their traditional music, then you can't have written the song. Yeah,
and songwriters
disappointed people like that too.
The singer-songwriter scene is all about writing songs that are sort of catchy and poppy, and Americana pop, and even there's this kind of saccharine sound that. And so I was looking for some kind of less. I was thinking, what would you do with this album if you were to enter a singer-songwriter competition, right? Which category would this go under? And I've looked at the categories, because it's not folk singer-songwriter.
Categories are
and it's
terrible.
not traditional. Where do I live in this world? That's
a big problem, isn't it? Generally, with so much with these categories, and I mean, of course, and then of course that also enters into the question also of like you're existing within a basically collapsed industry during a pandemic. But I mean, of course, the music industry collapsed long before the pandemic, as all of us who have ever attempted to be working musicians are know, at least in terms of the traditional model. Right. Yeah. I mean, you actually, but speaking of the traditional model, you put this out on vinyl record, huh?
Yeah.
Are you actually getting rid of any of those vinyl records? I got a lot of records in my apartment, and they're all the same record. I got like, I made 1,000 copies. I think I still have 800 of them.
Is it vinyl you have?
Yeah.
Oh, look at that.
One.
I think vinyl. I heard this story that I always liked, and I don't know if it's 100% true, but they a lot of the records that they keep at the Smithsonian Music Records, the most reliable, so we say data storage is vinyl. It's like this. It's just a simple needle. In fact, there's a book that says the Greeks could have created a record player back in 500 BC. The technology was there. So cool. The vinyl as an idea is that, like, if there is an apocalypse and the world blows up, and the electricity's gone, they'll be able to play your record, David.
That's great to know, though. Yeah, post-apocalypse, I'll be one of the ones that somebody might be able to listen to. That's cool.
It's the same category as my hand coffee grinder.
Yeah, I love hand coffee
After
grinders.
the apocalypse, it'll be gold.
It'll be gold.
But you probably had some of the similar reasons I did, and that was if you put something on vinyl, you're trying to control the context of how it's listened. And people then, I thought, listen, I don't want this. You can listen to the songs as they're streaming on Spotify, but if you want, I would prefer that you put the needle down and go sit down. And you can't, if you've got the vinyl, I'm force feeding this thing to you that you're going to have to experience it this way. And that suits some people. And I figure if somebody buys it and absorbs it that way, then there's a good chance that you might get to meet them.
That's a good theory.
I'll let you know when we meet up whether it works or not, because I have no
It's
idea.
sort of like the core audience theory or something.
Yeah, it's part of that core audience that you've built. Your whole scene is about connecting with the people that connect with you, and the ideas and the concepts that you're putting you want to get across, and hopefully they'll want to support that.
And Vincent, are you, before the pandemic anyway, you were doing quite a bit of touring? Because I know you were, at least when I met you, you were working as a teacher, and are you still doing that, or what's been the trajectory like in terms of touring, and then how's the pandemic music business going?
It's funny. It's an interesting question, but this has been the perfect time for me to stop playing music. And what I mean by that is I'm now absorbed in writing. It could be a novel or a memoir. I toured across Europe, and I kept really close records in my early 20s and diaries. And I meant to write something 30 years ago about that experience. And
what was the time period when you were touring around Europe?
It was like 1990 to 1993. I was in this roller coaster mode of street performing, and learning how to busk and learning. And I was absorbed by a handful of very important books that were going through my head, like Bound for Glory by Woody Guthrie, Down and Out in Paris and London by George Orwell. And I was reading.
Great book.
Yeah, scary book. There's some stuff in that really I found really disturbing. And On the Road by Jack Kerouac, and As I Roved Out by Lee Harper. And there's a couple of other books I didn't mention, but I had been turned on to just going out there, and I had an instrument, and it allowed me to meet people, and it allowed me to open up and connect with the world. And I wrote all this stuff down, and now I'm not playing anything. I put the instruments, and so I say I'm not writing any songs because I'm not touring.
They're distracting me.
And it is part of that. Because songs I've gotten so used to writing them, they're the first thing to come to me. But when it comes to writing a chapter, like I said, this is reflecting a memoir, looking at pictures, and it's the same. I'm using a process in this writing that I used for the album. In other words, I'm finding the voices or the style of writing that needs to be used to create this story.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why we need to keep albums. This is my opinion anyway.
You mean, what do you mean?
Because albums tell a whole story. Yeah. And I'm a big fan of preserving the art of the album, and your album is a great example of why. And I have a large collection, and a lot of it comes from Smithsonian Folkways, of what I think of as history concept albums that are about a person or about a theme and there's a whole, on the Song News Network YouTube channel, there's heaps of them.
Oh, I love those. And I wrote to the Smithsonian, and I said, I've got this album. And I said, will you put it on your label? This would be great for Folkways. And they wrote back to me and they said, well, we get lots of submissions. I don't know why I did that accent because that's an English one. But they get
My mother used to always do that.
Came across.
My mother would be like, if it's an accident of somebody who is sort of from the elite, then it's always like a sort of like a posh London kind of accent, you know.
And they said stuff like they really liked it.
There's a knock on my door.
We would put this out like no problem if. And they said they only put out 2% of what they get because the Folkways label does release new material. And I thought this would fit. But then they said the snapshot was too small. And I thought it was quite big because I went into Hicks and they said, if this came to us in the 70s, we would put it on the Folkways label. And I looked at other songs about New York City folk music, and there's only 2 from the 50s. And I studied the way, because I wanted this album to be something you pick up and you go, oh shit, there's old pictures on here. And look, this is a newspaper article. This must have really happened, and feel like you sit down there and you're reading these stories. The only thing I could have put a sleeve in there with the actual newspaper articles for each song.
Mm-hmm.
And that was to come out as a book, which I'm still kind of hemming and hawing about. What kind of book do you write about? Because that's what you said. We can talk about the history of the process. Does that all become a book in itself? And that's got nothing to do with writing a memoir, right?
Yeah, sure. Lots of potential books out there. With the memoir, are you thinking of actually putting it out as a physical book, or more? Are you thinking of some kind of an audio kind of thing? Because when I was working on memoir writing, I thought the best format ended up, to me, I don't know if it's very good or anything, but it just seemed like the best format was going to ultimately like audiobook format, because then I could seamlessly move from talking to playing songs, but what are you thinking about format?
It's a really great idea, but I'm not thinking of the audiobook, because in the same way that one of the things I want to do is to stop people from not reading. I want them to find that they can't fast forward the reading. Fuck off. You can't do that. You're gonna have to, if you're gonna get to you can't fast forward this stuff. You're gonna have to get there, And there's only one way to get through a book, and that's to read it.
Yes.
Yeah. So you've got some issues with short form communication and like Twitter and social media and stuff. Me too.
These are interesting
Emma
ideas.
Goldman said at the beginning of her collection of essays, she'd been making speeches her whole entire life, and she thought that was the best way to communicate. But she realized that if people didn't read stuff, they didn't retain it properly.
Right? I think that if you put it out there like a vinyl record, if you're writing, and I think writing a book is different from speaking a story. It's yes. You're structuring and organizing things. Now you can go from writing and then verbalizing, but then they're sort of different mediums in and of themselves. And if you want to add music to it, then you're mixing your mediums. You'll poison yourself. And so if you can get it in a book, that some little person will pick it up and they'll be taken like you were on this sort of literal journey, And if you can write, and there's great freedom to that, because I found songwriting in many respects restrictive.
Very.
It's like I gotta rhyme stuff. I gotta have choruses, and I'm going. I can write this novel, and I can just really get into a setting. You can't. You don't have time. You got to put that setting in the first verse in a ballad. You got your characters and your setting and the conflict. First stanza.
Yeah, that's right.
It's all about economy after that.
Get on.
Yeah. Very strict form. Yeah. Of course.
Yes.
You do it right, and you can tell a story that transports people in a matter of 2 minutes, and that's pretty amazing, But of course, it's a lot less content possibilities.
And another thing, when I always think about an artist, like Woody Guthrie wrote books. He wrote songs, but he wrote books. And I often wished that some of the people who play music and write songs would write books more often about their life, about what they went through as an artist and their growth as an artist and their experience as an artist. I would have loved to have heard Woody Guthrie write about his journey as a songwriter. I mean, why not? Wouldn't it be great? Woody telling you, but he loved to write about the people and the events. I'd love to hear John Lennon, write a book about his experience as a songwriter, and talk about the process. And there's so many people that have that they don't do it. It doesn't.
Why don't they? Is it just that they figured nobody's interested? It's just a two because we're trying to appeal to a broader public, I guess.
I think it partly is because their success destroys their ability to be creative on some level. They've become an industry, and so much depends upon them in that industry that if they try to create something that's outside of it, it's a huge risk that they won't hit their target audience. They can still do it for their own creative purposes. But when you're way up here and you do something and nobody cares about it, I wonder what it does to your self-esteem. It might just destroy. And writing is not something that can be done half-heartedly. You have to believe you're a writer, even if you're not. You have to really believe that you're capable of telling a story in words only.
And then once you've already established that you are a songwriter, like if people have acknowledged you on some level as a songwriter, that doesn't necessarily mean you think of yourself as a writer of some other kind, right? So then you start writing, and then you're sort of opening yourself up to this sort of a vulnerable situation.
What are you doing?
Again,
you're
right?
a songwriter. You're not a novelist.
And maybe people are going to say you suck too, and whereas you've already established you don't suck as a songwriter, so it's nice if people don't say you suck about something else, right? But of course, so often that's what happens when songwriters write books. Is sometimes they get praised, other times they get panned, and I don't know if that's part of the equation. There's the question of getting published, which is a whole other, because of course the publishing industry collapsed as the music industry also collapsed. So
there's that.
Yeah.
It's also, they're very different processes. Like, David, because you've done both things. You can write a song while you're touring, but you can't really write a whole book while you're touring. So, it's just a question of the style of commitment that's involved.
And you're absolutely right, Paula. As you bounce around from one small location to another, you have your little notebook, and you can scratch together songs, and they form over time, and they're on one piece of paper, and that's it. But
yes.
You've got, for the shortest chapter, you've got 8 pages, 1,500 words,
yes.
and you have to maintain an intention.
Yes.
Like writing an essay for college or something like that, but doing it every day.
My partner writes epic fantasy novels, so it's got to happen over years and years. Yeah.
It's such a discipline. It is.
Yeah, and it's really easy to be taken out of the context where you can do it at all. Yeah, so you have to be very careful with that. Yeah, it's all very long.
I can't imagine writing a novel until my children grow up. I mean, that just that sounds like way too much.
Yeah, and that's another.
I don't have that kind of time.
Yeah. Do you have it? A lot of the writers from Dylan Thomas to Rudyard Kipling, they have sheds in the garden, and
that's what I need.
Knock yourself a shed together and just go down there and they make those places very comfortable. It's the writer's shed, and you'll hear about it. I remember reading about it somewhere that you got to have that place where you go and no one disturbs you. If you're going to do any serious writing, songwriting you can do on a plane.
Yeah.
And there's a reason why you can do it on a plane, because it lends itself to very short. The music, for a start, we can cover up a lot of our bad writing with the music, for a start.
Ideally not.
I wouldn't put it that way at all, Vincent.
Because I always think, wow, poets, they've got no music, and you can sit there, watch. They realize that every syllable, every nuance of a word is. try and write something in song form that's as good as Mending Wall by Frost.
That's the aspiration.
How do you do that? Because that doesn't exist in song form for a reason.
I mean, I think the best writers of prose are often closet poets, and they don't tell you that really they're approaching their prose as poetry, and that's why it's so good. But when I started writing essays, I started approaching it as poetry that didn't rhyme, and then everybody started saying, "Oh, you're such a good writer." But it was just about the approach, because I just noticed, like, why is it that I like Robert Fisk, John Ross, and Eduardo Galeano so much? Oh, because they're all poets. They're all poets. They're all amazing writers. It's not just the content; it's that they all are just such writers, and of course, and two of the three of them are open poets. The other, I suspect, is a poet, but just didn't, ever publish.
The great thing about what the poet does, and you know it yourself, is there's great training in being a songwriter, because you're trying to make the most impact with the least amount of words. And if you write novels or stories where you're getting rid of the words that don't matter, I find all the time I'm just striking out on the second edit. This is gone, that line's gone, that's gone. And then I look at what I've done and go, why did I cut everything out? Because everything wasn't necessary. It's all about getting this thing to move with the least cogs or the least mechanisms, so it's simple. And poets operate on that kind of concept, that it can get very based on allusions and the Greeks and Ovid, and you can get lost in some of that Ozymandias by Shelley, and you can, what the hell is this thing? And but like, I love Frost because I think he's one of those economists of language, that everything he does it's short, keeping
like
it.
Yates is like that.
Yes. And it is about that. If you're writing and you're economizing, then poets, a poet is always going to be, I think, one of the better types of writers out there. So songwriting trains you for that. If you were to it'd be great to do a class where you train novelists to write poetry, so it'll teach them economy,
That's a good idea.
Novelists don't need economy.
That's kind of cool. Actually, you said, David, that you write a lot. You're one of, and there are different kinds of.
He does all the time.
But you've got you would thousands and thousands of words and things. I had the hardest thing where I can't do that a lot of the time. For me, 8 pages of a chapter, and I got it said. I don't need to say anything more here. Do I need to bring? And then I start thinking about, well, hold on, maybe I could bring in a little bit here, and I end up always taking it and adding, and then just it's the accordion effect. You expand it again, and then you shrink it down, and then you expand it again, and you shrink it, and then you're left with the juice of all the grapes, the essence, and that's what you're trying to get with the is I'm trying to get 3 years, but really and squeeze it, so that it's just
Yeah, I mean, I totally, the first time I did end up writing sort of a memoir and a novel, I guess, sort of novella or something. But other previous efforts at both novella and memoir writing, they followed exactly that trajectory that you're describing, where like I wrote it and then I just kept on cutting it down to the essential parts. And then there was nothing left. I just like cut it down to nothing. I was like, okay, that editing process totally didn't work. I just edited the thing into nothing, but so, yeah, I guess one thing that says is that there is something very much to be said for editors, producers, directors. There's a great value in that role, but just getting something to the point where it's ready to even present to an editor. It's kind of,
I'm a ways off there. And it's like, that the great journey is to find out what was the essence of this particular experience, to trim away to see the wood for the trees. What was it? And I found that as I look at most of what I was going through when I was 20, I'm still going through it now, and I'm still this. It's like I'm writing the same story over and over again. A smart person would do it once and do it right.
I know a great song about it.
What's that?
There's a great song about it. There's a band, Australian band called the Birds of Tokyo. They wrote a song called My Greatest Mistakes. It's about that, but in poetry form.
I'm making note of that.
Well, I want to
pen
read
and paper,
that
write it
memoir.
down. It's a reference.
Good. No, I jotted that down. We've run out of time, haven't we?
I know.
I suppose
You're a man after my own heart.
Dinner over here, but
It's not a great line.
Looking forward to that memoir.
Oh yes. Oh yeah. There's so many books that other people need to write so I can read them.
Yeah.
And what about your
just
book?
added to my list.
Everybody has a good book in them and a good album in them and maybe a good play.
I'm hoping I have a good play.
It's a good orientation. Everybody should try writing one of each.
Because you're what you're trying to do is to get to some of the essential parts of your character, of who you are. And wouldn't it be great if down the line some of your ancestors pick it up and go, geez, that Vincent was one fucked up person, wasn't he? they get to read the stuff. And I would have loved to have read what Corcoran wrote. Corcoran, there's only a few words he says to the judge. And even my grandfather, dead and gone, not a word. I know nothing. And my own father I speak to all the time, but sure, he's not a man to write anything down. So who's going to be the one to tell the stories? Who's going to and that's what we do. If I don't know why I didn't choose to document, but here I sit, I write a song, I document. I write a story, I document, and what better way than I put it in a book and then it's throw it out into the firmament,
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's one of those things, like as with so many other things, there's some people that do so much documenting in so many different ways. And if anybody ever tries to watch the number of interviews I've done in just 2020, they're going to drive themselves nuts. And then there's so many other people who never document a thing, and there's all that's left is like maybe a photograph.
What you could do, David, is you could create one 45-minute video of the highlights. And say, look,
but how much
the
work
best
is that?
of the greatest hits.
The greatest hits of everything I've done in the last 2 years in 45 minutes. I wonder what you'd learn from that.
You've become a good American, Vincent.
I think
you do it, Vincent, and I'll react to it. How about that? Then we'll be really modern.
It just sounds so awful, but of course it's going to be done at some point. The move, the really like horrible movie version. It's not. it's of course, if anybody wants to try to boil things down to something, then there's got to be the opportunity to just get it all wrong. But
I
don't know.
That's always a good point. If you take away all of the wrong roads, all the wrong paths, you give this impression of a perfect individual, and you read a story like that, and life isn't like that. And no, you're right. Novels aren't real. Memoirs aren't real.
No.
And songs aren't real either.
No.
And
just trying to write a memoir where you don't incriminate anybody, or don't say, don't write about somebody that you think will probably read the thing. You can see why Mark Twain wanted to publish his memoir 100 years after his death. I haven't read it, right? But it just was recently published, and he didn't
even show up for the reading.
No, he didn't. He made no plans.
He would have if he could have.
You see, you guess what I always think is, if I enjoy reading what I've written to other people, like a song, then there's a buzz out of that. And I didn't think you could get that when you wrote shorts, chapters, whatever they were. And then I began to feel, hey, this is actually fun. I don't even have to be in tune. I know even instruments. I can just put a microphone here and just start reading and enjoy. If the writing is if I feel the writing's good enough, or I feel I'm enjoying, I figure the judging is the fact that I'm enjoying reading it.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
That's it was very good. Yeah. Well, one of the things that I found about writing a story with characters in it is that you're developing these characters who you feel like you get to really know and become friends with. And then by the end of the whole experience of writing the thing, they're sort of in your life, but they're not, because they're not real. They're only in your head. And the only other people who really know them are people that read your book, which, like in my case, is like 2 people. So, like
3. I read
I
it.
can have conversations with like 2 people about these people that don't exist in my life. But, if a few more people read my book, then I'd feel like a little more like, sort of, I could talk about this book, but you can't really talk about a book that you wrote that nobody's read. It's like that's but then it's so much more of an undertaking to actually read a book than to like listen to a song. I mean, you can talk about a song nobody's heard because within 2 minutes they can fix that, listen to it. But yeah,
but you can repeat stories that have never been written down, and thus they'll never be read. And I don't, most of the character, mine's autobiographical. I mean, it may become a novel because, let's face it, when you read On the Road, those are real people with names changed. And he was able to, get away with some of the legal problems by doing that. But what I love about writing now and doing it through this particular format of using these old journals is these people have been living in my head for 30 years, if not gone away.
Yeah.
I see, and when I'm writing, I'm using the journal, and then I remember all this other stuff that it's the picture.
Right? You dredge it up. There's more memory.
And it's color there. And then he went in, and I'm going, where's this coming from? I didn't write any of that down because that's the story. That stuff.
You remember by association. Yeah.
It's amazing. Right. And I'm going, I didn't know that this, and then I look back at it all, and then that's the idea of, you got to crush and get rid of and get it down to its essence, because it could just get so out of control, because it's 3 whole years in 300 pages. Right?
Yep.
Yeah.
There'll be a lot of live streaming.
It's a lot of conversations that are going on in those 3 years, especially at that time. If you're evolving at those years in your early 20s, you're a sponge.
Yes.
Yeah. And you're taking it all in, and then it's too much. And then you get to your 30s and you're bloated. And you don't know what to do with it all, and
you pass some wind.
So you have to start crushing it down, and then it becomes a nice shiny turd.
Yeah, shiny turd. Punctured. You need to get punctured.
Punctured.
I've kept his all up now. What time is it with you, David?
Yeah, we better go, huh? It's
We've
like
gone way over
here
time
5:20, but yeah. 5:20 p.m. over there. It's 8:20 Australia. It's early in the morning.
You're good. I'm the one.
No, it's like mid-morning here, so
your days are getting going. I'm gonna have to get my jammies on.
10 to 12 even.
I forget over there.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a great pleasure. Thank you both for.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been great, Vincent. We'll have to do it again.
Absolutely. Hopefully, we'll get to meet up again. It's in the flesh, as they say. But this is fun.
Oh yeah.
This is fun on some level, and when we can do this and that, it's like a Seinfeld episode.
That's right.
Interfere with that, because this is good and that's good too, right?
Yes, absolutely. It's all good. Everything is good, Vincent.
It is.
And this has been an episode of Song News Network Presents with Vincent Cross, and you can hear his latest album and other ones as well at vincentcross.com. And you can check out the archived episode of this here on the various Vincent's Facebook page, as well as on Song News Network's Facebook page. And in audio form, it'll shortly be up in podcast form if you look for it This Week with David Rovix, wherever you get your podcasts. And we'll just end on that note. Thank you, everybody.